Hi, everyone. I'm Kayvon Karazian with Demand Progress. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to our panelists. We're going to be discussing what could possibly be the biggest foreign policy decision that this Congress is going to have to face, and one of their greatest opportunities. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to all of the panelists and our moderator. Just a quick reminder, we do have the Q&A function set up. After our panelists will give our presentations and answer some questions. Feel free to send in questions during the whole panel. I'll try to filter in some questions that may be relevant to the current conversation. If not, we'll save them to the end and we'll try to get through as many as possible. For any people that are calling in, you can send questions to me via email, cavan@demandprogress.org. And yeah, without further ado, I'm gonna pass it on to you, Erik.
Thanks so much, Kayvon, for organizing this. It's really an honor for me to be moderating a panel with such esteemed experts and activists. My name is Erik Sperling. I'm the Executive Director of Just Foreign Policy, which was founded in 2006 originally to oppose the war in Iran. And we continue to look for promote legislative strategies to combat different forms of harmful U.S. foreign policy and try to direct that towards a just foreign policy, as we say. Some of you may know me from my years as a congressional staffer with Congressman Sanaa and John Conyers. I began working on Yemen back in 2015, about a month after the war started, and little by little we've seen congressional opposition to this war grow, and it's culminated in the passage of a war powers resolution, which was unfortunately vetoed by Trump. But we now have a new president who has committed to ending this war, been a long-standing position. And it's really important because Yemen's facing, as you'll hear more from our panelists, Yemen is facing perhaps the most dire situation of the entire war. The Trump administration has slashed aid to Yemen, and then right before they left office, designated the Houthi movement, which controls about 80% of Yemen's population, as terrorists, and which poses huge threats to humanitarian aid delivery. So you'll hear a lot more about all of this. But President Biden has taken some positive early steps, including pausing arms sales to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and putting a temporary exemption on restrictions, some restrictions that follow from the terror designation. So, and another sign of hope is we just had one of the biggest mobilizations since the Iraq War. 386 organizations in more than 17 countries came together last Monday, January 25th, to protest this war both in person, in many rallies in person, and with a massive online rally. So I think without further ado, we'll proceed and hear from our amazing panelists. You can submit questions through the Zoom function. And if you're calling on the phone, you can email them to Kayvon, C-A-V-A-N, @demandprogress.org. Our panelists include Bruce Riedel, who's a senior fellow and director of the Brookings Intelligence Project, which is part of the Brookings Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. He serves as a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy. He retired in 2006 after 30 years of service at the Central Intelligence Agency, including postings overseas. He was a senior advisor on South Asia and the Middle East to the last 4 presidents of the United States and the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. He was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Near East and South Asia at the Pentagon and a senior advisor to NATO in Brussels. Jehan Hakim chairs the Yemeni Alliance Committee, which was formed after the first Muslim ban to support Yemeni American communities in the Bay Area during periods of social unrest. The Yemeni Action Committee's Alliance Committee focus recently has been advocating to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen by raising awareness and pushing legislation. Their founders also happen to be from Yemen and are directly impacted by these issues. And through their organizing and advocacy, they aim to equip communities and allies with the tools to challenge this harmful national security and foreign policy that impacts Yemenis and Yemeni Americans. And Hassan El-Tayyab is the Friends Committee on National Legislation's lead lobbyist on Middle East policy. He's convinced that advancing a more peaceful and based foreign policy in the Middle East is critical, not only for the family he loves, but for peace and stability worldwide. His writings and commentaries have been featured in numerous news outlets, including the BBC, The Hill, Al Jazeera, Huffington Post, and many more. You can follow him on Twitter and follow all of our panelists on Twitter. Hassan is at Hassan El-Tayyab. We can provide the exact handles for everyone who's interested. So I think the first topic should be an overview of the current situation in Yemen. I think we want to hear about the people who are really impacted by this war. The UN has said that this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And the UN Secretary General has warned that the country's on the brink of the worst famine we've seen in decades. And we'd also like to know, I think, how the Saudi and UAE-led coalition's role in the conflict has contributed to this humanitarian crisis. Jehan, would you be able to share your view on those questions?
Sure, thank you. If I may share my screen, one of our interns made a really nice presentation. Okay, folks see it okay? Not seeing everyone, I'm assuming it's a yes, right? Okay.
Looks great here.
Okay, so following the lead of my mentor, Dr. Aisha Jama'an of YRRF, Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, who always remembers to present a piece of Yemen's beauty, we thought to share some of what Yemen used to look like in the Yemen that we remember, which was once known as Yemen as-Sa'id, or Happy Yemen. Its geography, natural climate, rainfall, and valleys was once revered by the Romans. So geography matters. I think, I know when we first started lobbying in 2015, we had to bring a map of Yemen with us. And it's just kind of puts things into perspective to just remind us kind of where this is all happening. Here you'll see two different maps of the sovereign country of Yemen. The one on the bottom left shows us a breakdown of larger cities. It also shows us the difference between the north and the south, which is it's united. Sanaa was always the capital of Yemen until recently, however. What some may call the internationally recognized Yemeni government declared Aden as the temporary capital of Yemen, which is in the south. The map on the right gives us an idea of Yemen's borders. So you can see that Yemen borders Saudi Arabia and Oman. It's a boat ride away from Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. It has a population of about 28 million, some say 30 million, similar to that of Venezuela. 80% of Yemenis live in the north, while the rest of Yemenis live in the south, in the southern part. 40% of Yemen's population is under the age of 16, and the dominant language is Arabic, and it's a Muslim majority country. Also wanted to note that $1 US is equivalent to 250 riyals. And according to the World Bank, 40% of Yemeni households have estimated to lost their primary source of income since the war. So in 2011, right, we know about the Arab Spring that took the MENA by storm in the democratic wave that entered Yemen fairly early. Civil unrest continued even after that for the next 3 years. And then in September of 2014, a civil war broke out. But why it matters to us here in the States and to Western countries is because in the eve of March 26th, 2015, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of Malik Salman, who had been crown prince for just a few months, launched airstrikes on Yemen. And it abruptly escalated a local civil war into a regional inferno. It was called Operation Decisive Storm. The intervention began as a mission that was supposed to be temporary, to last just for a few months. And it's been almost 6 years now. Since March of 2015, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and its coalition, which includes Arab countries such as Kuwait, Bahrain, Sudan, Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, and there are other countries that are kind of been in and out. These countries have been bombing Yemen from the air. This is why it matters to us. The coalition is backed and supported by the US and the UK and other partners who have been providing the coalition with the the US trained Saudi forces. We also maintain, repair, and upgrade the coalition's vehicles and aircrafts. We provide intelligence support and targeting assistance. There have also been Green Berets and US Special Forces at the Saudi-Yemeni border. And in 2018, this scaled back just a bit, and we stopped providing mid-air refueling. In addition to military support, the United States under the Obama administration provided the coalition with weapons. Weapons from US-made bomb manufacturers such as Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing. There have been over 120 arms contracts totaling $120 million a month. There were over $110 billion worth of arms sold to the coalition under Obama. And then contracts made under the Trump administration totaled up to $350 billion. Some of those have been put on pause by the Biden administration. Amongst the most brutal parts of this war, and one that receives very little attention, is the blockade. The coalition imposed a naval, land, and air blockade in Yemen since the conflict began in March of 2015, which has severely restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians. It continues to prevent much needed aid into and nearly all commercial imports from reaching Houthi-controlled ports, which has had a disproportionate impact on civilians who are apolitical and their access to essential goods. In a country that relies heavily on imported food, medicine, and fuel for up to 80 to 90% of its population's needs, the blockade has been on and off and has been backed by the US Navy. And also the Sanaa International Airport has been shut down since then as well. The only airport that is functioning is in Sayoun, and then another one in Aden, which is also open and closed sometimes. Yemenis are effectively boxed in. We have heard the UN stating that Yemen is on the brink of a famine. The Yemen hunger crisis classified by UN agencies has been measured throughout the period of the war, which is depicted here on the map on this slide. There are 5 classifications of level of severity of acute food insecurity, and they are level 1, which is in the mint color, which means that minimal to no hunger, and you can't find that on the map currently. Level 2, which is stressed in the color yellow, which is found in 2 parts of Yemen, here in Hadramaut and elsewhere. Level 3, which is called crisis. This is the color orange, which as you can see is throughout most of Yemen in the north and the south. Level 4 is emergency, which is in red. And it seems to be mostly in the northern part of Yemen, which is where the Houthis are controlling, which is where over 80% of Yemenis live. Level 5 is catastrophe and full-fledged famine, which thankfully has not been reported, as we know, so far in Yemen. As of December of 2020, over 80% of Yemen's population, that's over 24 million Yemenis, are in need of humanitarian assistance, including over 11 million in acute need of assistance. And these statistics were before the State Department announced it would designate the Houthis or Ansarullah as FTOs. Part of our advocacy ask has been to reverse this designation, because while we are looking at staggering numbers of mass starvation, further cuts to aid, further restrictions will push Yemen into a level 5, which is full-fledged famine, which will starve millions more. It is why the blockade on Yemen must be lifted. Aid should never be a weapon. So what has the impact look like? Yemen is facing the world's worst humanitarian crisis that we've seen in decades, as Erik mentioned. It is being bombed and starved by some of the most powerful and wealthiest countries. And since 2015, it has resulted in over 200,000 Yemenis who've been killed by the violence. And over 90,000 Yemeni children have starved to death due to the onset of famine. The UN released a report that predicts that the death toll will surpass 230,000 Yemenis by the end of 2020. I want to note that 2/3 of civilian casualties have been due to the airstrikes. 90% of Yemenis do not have access to electricity. Over 16 million Yemenis do not have access to healthcare. And this is especially important as we're looking at how to curb COVID. Over 3 million Yemenis are internally displaced, and because of the blockade and the ban that has been rescinded, thankfully, there hasn't been access to get out of Yemen or even come back in. Over 16 million Yemenis do not have access to clean drinking water, and this has brought on fatal diseases such as cholera and diphtheria. The world's worst cholera outbreak ever recorded has infected over 2 million Yemenis and killed thousands, and this is a preventable disease. It shouldn't exist in this modern day. They say pictures are worth 1,000 words. I don't want to bring pictures of the bodies or just those are too gory. But here we can see in the top left, school children being taught in a makeshift classroom in Taiz, in a building that has been destroyed by airstrikes. Residues of these bombs say made in the USA, and the people of Yemen know where these bombs are coming from. The bottom left in picture 2 is where Yemeni children are digging graves for their classmates who were killed in August of 2018 when a Saudi-led airstrike bombed their school bus on their way to school. And that targeting assistance was provided by us. The top right over there, number 3, is a recent one from May of last year that shows mass graves being dug in Aden, in the south, which is now the capital, due to COVID deaths. In the bottom right, number 4 is what old Sanaa looks like now. Their core has been hit by airstrikes, and floods have also exacerbated the situation. And this was once a UNESCO heritage site. A UNESCO heritage site is collapsing. This should be an international crisis on its own. Now that COVID has entered the arena, lack of access to clean water, and a crumbled infrastructure, lack of fuel, and a collapsed healthcare system, curbing this virus is seemingly impossible. COVID could spread faster, more widely, and with deadlier consequences than many other countries. I mean, we're struggling here in the States. On top of that, the same day that COVID was announced in Yemen, which was in April, 2 international agencies, USAID and the World Food Program, cut aid into Houthi-controlled areas, where, like I said, over 80% of Yemenis live. And to date, of course, this number is severely underreported. The status of COVID in Yemen is over 2,000 declared cases and over 600 dead. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that sobering, heartbreaking account of what's happening in Yemen. Really appreciate that. And I think what's a lot of Americans, I think the most Americans and even some staffers continue to be unclear about what the U.S. role in this conflict is. I think the Defense Department has not always been very clear about what that role really contains. So I think the Biden administration has signaled that it will end that support. But I think it would be great to hear from Bruce if you could talk a bit about what the U.S. role has actually been and how the U.S. has supported the Saudi UAE-led coalition and how dependent they are on U.S. support.
The war in Yemen is an American war. We don't have combat troops on the ground for the most part, but we provide the aircraft, the munitions, the ships, the tanks, virtually everything that the Saudi forces use. Just to give you a little bit of numbers, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is the preeminent think tank that studies arms sales and arms transfers around the world, in the first 5 years of the war, so from 2015 through to the end of 2019, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia purchased over $64 billion in new weapons from the United States. That averages out to about $10 billion a year. That's both an example of how expensive the war is for Saudi Arabia, but it's also a very good insight into how much this is an American war. Now, of course, America has sold Saudi Arabia weapons going back decades. President Obama was one of the most prolific in selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. But these are new purchases brought on because of the war, and they underscore just how much the United States is deeply involved in this. 73% of Saudi Arabia's arms in the first 5 years of the war came from the United States of America, 73%. And second place is the United Kingdom, which provided 13%. If you get the United States and the United Kingdom to cut off arms support to Saudi Arabia, you will literally end Saudi Arabia's capacity to carry out military operations. The Royal Saudi airports could not operate without the logistical spare parts, technicians, and expertise that comes from the United States. To its credit, Italy has now decided to completely ban arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We'll see if the Biden administration is prepared to go as far as that as well. I'll say a few other things about the American role. The United States is not officially part of the blockade, but in practice it is a part of the blockade. The reason we know that is every now and then the United States Navy or the Pentagon more broadly announces that they have intercepted a dhow or some other ship bringing Iranian arms to the Houthis. Well, the only way we would be able to do that is if we are, in fact, actively monitoring what is going in and out of Yemeni ports. And that means we are, in effect, collaborating with the blockade. That is, in many ways, the most direct American participation in the war there is, especially since we ceased doing air-to-air refueling missions back in 2018, as Jehan pointed out earlier. Why did we cease doing air-to-air refueling? Well, part of it was pressure from Congress. There's no question about that. But the bigger part was the UAE and Bahrain and other air forces who flew from bases in Abu Dhabi or Manama ceased operating in the air war or reduced their operational tempo considerably, and therefore they didn't need air-to-air refueling from the United States anymore. The Saudis have air bases much closer to Yemen, particularly to the parts of North Yemen that they bombed the most, Sanaa and Sada. They don't need air-to-air refueling to carry out those missions. So the United States is deeply, deeply involved in this. There are some interesting paradoxes here, though, worth looking for in the future. According to generally reliable accounts, the commander of CENTCOM when the war began, General Lloyd Austin, opposed American support for the war. We don't know how vocally he made that opposition to it, but behind closed doors, he apparently thought that it was a mistake for the Saudis to take on the Houthis. It was a mistake for the United States to join them in that. He did know, as we know from other very reliable sources, that the Houthis had an intelligence liaison relationship with the United States before 2015 that included cooperation against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and other jihadist terrorist organizations, cooperation that the United States found to be quite useful. Well, of course, Lloyd Austin is now Secretary of Defense. We don't know what his current views are. I think that the Senate confirmation process tended to focus a little bit too much on the question of whether a former general should be Secretary of Defense. I would have liked to have seen a lot more questioning about his views on the war in Yemen, about Saudi Arabia, subjects of which he is a real expert. I would hope that in future Senate and House hearings with the general, and now in his new role as Secretary of Defense, more of that kind of information could be brought out. The Saudis are nervous, I think it's safe to say, about the US cutting off. They've certainly seen what the Biden administration has said during its campaign. They know that there is a solid majority in the Hill to take action and that they won't have a Trump veto anymore. But what is striking to me is despite all of that, they seem to be eager to continue the war. A war that is now 6 years old, that is at best a stalemate from their standpoint, that cost them a fortune, as I've already laid out. They were the pushing force behind designating the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization. Now, admittedly, they were pushing on an open door in Mike Pompeo, who was eager to do it. But pushing for the FTO designation is not a sign that the Saudis are interested in bringing the war to an end. To the contrary, it's a sign that they somehow believe that they can still win this war. I suspect a big part of that involves the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince knows that the war in Yemen is his signature foreign policy issue. It may be his signature issue of all time, aside from the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And a war that ends with a de facto partition of Yemen, not into two parts, but into multiple parts, in which the 80% of the population is under the control of the Houthis, and Iran has significantly enhanced its infrastructure in North Yemen over the last 6 years, including now having a full-time ambassador in Sanaa, will be seen rightly by people as a defeat and as a setback. And the blame will have to be given to the Crown Prince. This is his war, and he blundered into it with apparently no real strategy for winning and with no end state in mind that was achievable. So it's his war, but Americans need to understand, as I started, this is also our war. This is America's war. And it's time to stop America's participation in this war.
Thank you so much for that. And Bruce, just to clarify, if you could reiterate, I think one more time, what is your sense that if the U.S. cuts support, what is the Saudi coalition able to continue this war? Because you often hear, well, the U.S. can't end this war on its own. It's a common thing that we hear. But what would happen if the U.S. ended the support that you're describing?
If the United States cut off the flow of spare parts, technical assistance, and expertise, the Saudi Air Force would be grounded. It just can't operate. It needs the support of the United States. It operates American equipment. Without that flow of spare parts, it just simply no longer can function. Now, does that mean that the entire war ends? No, I suspect there would continue to be fighting between the Houthis and various other forces on the ground. But the most horrific part of the war, the aerial bombardment and the naval blockade, which also requires American spare parts to continue, would come to an end. That's why this issue is so important. You can be critical of American policy towards Syria, for example. We didn't do enough to help the forces of change in Syria. But our ability to influence the outcome in Syria was always limited. After all, Syria had been a Soviet or Russian client state for 50 years. They don't have any American equipment. That's not the case in this war. The belligerents in this war on one side, the Saudis and most of their allies, including the Emiratis, fly American equipment. They use American equipment. Congress has a capacity to do something here, which goes way beyond just talking, to actually doing something would significantly improve the quality of life for 30 million Yemenis.
Well, I think that's a perfect cue for our next question, which is about the status of efforts to end this war in Congress and with the administration. For that, we have Hassan with FCNL. Hassan, could you give us an overview of kind of the past legislative efforts and to shape U.S. policy towards Yemen and where it's at now and the role that Congress can play going forward?
Yeah, thank you so much, Erik. Thank you to Demand Progress for putting this panel on. Thank you to Jehan and Bruce for your really poignant thoughts and commentary on everything that's been going on. Many of the folks that are listening and watching this panel probably know a lot of this, but there's been a lot of action on the Hill over the past several years to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen. There was a Yemen War Powers resolution that was introduced in 2018 to cut off support for the coalition led by Senator Sanders, Murphy, and Lee, and that fell short of the votes we needed, but it was taken up again later on that same year, in December 13th, 2018, and SJ Res 54 was able to pass. It was the first War Powers resolution that was able to pass one chamber. And I think just from the outset, I think it's a really important to understand that we've seen a really consistent pattern is that international pressure on support for the coalition, military support for the coalition, has really changed factors on the ground in Yemen. And that's a really important thing to stress. It's no coincidence that, in my mind, that the 2018 Stockholm Agreement paving the way for a ceasefire in the port city of Hodeidah was signed the same day as the Congress passed that Yemen War Powers resolution. And just previously, as more and more pressure built up, the Trump administration ended mid-air refueling for Saudi warplanes, which was really significant. There were more votes. SJ Res 7 was introduced in 2019, got a vote in March 2019. That passed through both chambers, as folks maybe recall. And we saw, more momentum build. More and more Americans were paying attention. More folks in Congress were, making their voices heard. And we saw, some other changes happening. Following the ceasefire and more votes, we saw that the UAE drew down militarily. And I say that with a caveat because they're still involved militarily, just via proxies in Yemen. And there's definitely still a part of the violence, but we did see them militarily draw down some. We saw a reduction in cross-border attacks by both Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, and a revival of negotiations. But after congressional negotiators dropped provisions from the National Defense Authorization Act to end support for the war, we did see an uptick in violence in early 2020, unfortunately. And, there was the Connor-Smith Amendment to end support for the war that include intel sharing, logistical support, and the spare parts transfers that Bruce spoke about. But there was also the Malinowski Amendment to cut off weapon sales to the coalition, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. After those were stripped out, we saw the violence increase, and I think, so I just bring that up to just kind of flag that, there's, folks are listening, the people of Yemen are watching what happens in the Congress, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are as well. So our voices are really important. Now, where are we now? The FTO designation was mentioned. That's really critical that in my mind and in the minds of humanitarians, Yemeni activists, and all over the U.S. And the UN. They are warning that this could really exacerbate the humanitarian situation by cutting off the flow of humanitarian aid to, the northern part of Yemen, where 80% of the population lives. So, it's a welcome sign that they were able to pause that pause the sanctions on the Houthis, but what's really needed is a lifting of that designation, and so humanitarian aid and peace talks can resume. I just wanted to raise up the great letter that was led by Chairman Meeks and others on the House side. Thank you for anyone that signed that letter. I believe 25 members of Congress signed that. But we need more pressure on the administration, in my opinion. So more statements opposing the FTO designation. On the weapon sales piece, again, it was welcome that the Biden administration put a pause on both UAE and Saudi weapons. So I think that's a fantastic thing. Just on the UAE weapons, there was a vote, joint resolutions of disapproval in the Senate that failed to get a majority, but we got I think 46 Democrats and Rand Paul joined that effort. So a solid block, but more needs to be done to carry that out and actually block the weapons. And so what recently happened was Chairman Meeks introduced two resolutions of disapproval to block the Saudi sales, HJ Res 15 and HJ Res 16. So those are really critical. I think there's about 27 co-sponsors so far. If your boss hasn't co-sponsored that yet, I think that's really important. And that lays a marker down that the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a bunch of members of Congress want to see that we stop the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I think it would be great to also do legislation on the, in the House and Senate to oppose weapons to the UAE as well. Because again, both of these actors are contributing heavily to the violence in the war. And on top of just their role in the war in Yemen and the airstrikes on civilian targets, agricultural infrastructure, school children, weddings, they're also transferring, there's cases of them transferring these weapons to Al-Qaeda affiliates in Yemen. And obviously that's deeply problematic. The UAE has been caught transferring weapons just by the UN embargo in Libya. So that's another reason. And, I could go on, but those are some of the main things we're looking at. And as we try to negotiate a ceasefire in Yemen that includes all parts of Yemeni society, that really brings in women, women and girls, brings in all the parties, all the civil society groups. We think that weapon sales and military support to the conflict, to the warring parties in the conflict is going to make it really difficult to be able to secure the ceasefire that we need. The FTO designation, again, also makes it more difficult. I wanted to also mention that Representative Ro Khanna is considering introducing another Yemen War Powers resolution. And in FCNL's position, in our perspective, that's a really important resolution, an important move. And we think so for a few reasons. It's great news that the Biden administration has promised to end support for the war. And I think that's significant. But we really think that Congress should be a part of this conversation. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 is absolutely clear that only Congress has the power to declare war. This war was unauthorized. We've been, helping the Saudi coalition with these airstrikes for about 6 years now. And so we want Congress to also be a part of the solution in ending support for the war. So that's one. I think it's going to establish a really important constitutional precedent. It would be the first time a War Powers resolution would have ever been passed by both chambers and signed into law by the executive branch. And I think that's also really significant as we, strengthen this tool to end and prevent unauthorized wars going into the future, and just having a simple debate. So the part of our government that's most accountable to the people most often, is making important decisions and having this oversight and consent role. I think it's also worth mentioning that a Yemen War Powers resolution would make it so it's not just able to be torn up by through executive orders down the road if there's another president that comes in 4 to 8 years, so that becomes a law. And it'll also help UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths. It'll allow him to show the Saudi-led coalition that it's not just Biden, but it's Biden and bicameral, bipartisan majorities in Congress that want to end the war. And I think that's a way stronger hand. And so, again, I encourage folks to reach out, to Ro Khanna's office and express support if you do support that idea and are eagerly looking to bring an end to U.S. participation in this horrible war. And with that, I'm gonna end there, and happy to take the questions.
Yeah, Hassan, thank you so much for that. I would just quickly ask, some would say, it's only 2 weeks into the Biden administration. I think those of us who follow Yemen have seen estimates that I've seen different estimates for every 5 minutes to every 10 minutes, a Yemeni child dies from preventable causes due to this crisis. But many will say, well, Biden's only 2 weeks in. We should give him time to do that. What would you say to people who make that argument?
I would say what I've been saying for the past few years is Yemen can't wait. You know, we have the world's worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. School age children are dying every 10 minutes because of, essentially, there's 50,000 people in Yemen, according to the UN. Like, I think last week said that 50,000 Yemenis are living in a famine right now, and 5 million people are a step away. So what we need to do is end the war and put pressure on the warring parties to reach a ceasefire deal. And I think, having Congress, act in this way will move the wheels of change along faster.
Thank you so much for that. So in a moment, I think we will go to final thoughts from each of our panelists. But before that, I wanted to remind our viewers that you could submit questions, and please do that. So we'll have a Q&A after each panelist gives their final takeaway thought here. I think we'll go in the order of the panelists. Jehan, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists and for everyone tuning in. I guess if I can close it with something is that I think January 6th was a reminder that the democracy that we thought we had, is a fragile one, and that we have a lot of work to do at home. And I'm sure lawmakers are all working on changing systemic policies that have been rooted in racism, biases that have oppressed vulnerable communities here in the US. I think it's important that we need to also remember that we need to reboot our foreign policies. All the isms and phobias that transcend borders are also an American problem. And the Biden administration promised Yemeni Americans two things: that he would rescind the Muslim ban and that he would end US support for the war in Yemen. He followed through with ending the Muslim ban on his first day in office. Today's day 15, like Erik mentioned, and we've heard progressives saying we want to move in the direction of ending endless wars, in the direction of putting checks on the executive branch and not repeating the mistakes of Vietnam, repeating history. So we shouldn't be asking each other, why should the US stop supporting war crimes on Yemen or elsewhere? We should be asking our lawmakers, when will the US stop arming the coalition against Yemen and end US involvement in the war on Yemen? According to the UN, as Erik said, if we follow that formula that every 10 minutes a child under 5 dies in Yemen due to preventable diseases, that means in the last 15 days under this new administration, 2,190 children may have died. They didn't have to. And Trump is no longer in office. We can't continue to blame our systemic woes on his recklessness, or he's not here to veto another war powers resolution. Congress has the power to prevent what's happening in Yemen, and it has to be done ASAP. In order to really practice progress, Yemen must be a foreign policy priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Bruce.
Several things. I want to underscore Hassan's point that we need the Congress to be involved. We've been at war in my lifetime from the day I was born. And yet there has never been a declaration of war by the United States Congress. I'm not going to say how many years that is, but I think you can all fairly guess. That's remarkable. We've gone to war from Vietnam to Iraq, and now effectively to Yemen, without the Congress of the United States undertaking a declaration of war. The authorization for the use of force has been stretched now beyond the breaking point. To even use it to justify American support for the war in Yemen is ridiculous. The Houthis are not Sunni jihadists. They may be bad folks, they may engage in human rights violations, but they are not Sunni jihadists. It's absurd to trying to justify the force. I think it is very, very important that the Congress. I think it's also very important to remember what we've said earlier, that this is a case where we can really make a difference. We may not be able to bring peace and harmony to Yemen. In the end, that's Yemenis who are going to have to do that. But we can certainly curb the worst features of the Saudi coalition-led war, the air war, the blockade, and the like. That is what is contributing to the horrific statistics that Jehan has so ably laid out for all of us. I think the thought that every 10 minutes a Yemeni child under 5 dies is a horrific factor and suggests, yes, the Biden administration needs to get moving. I know they got a lot of things to do, but when you were elected to the presidency of the United States and to the Congress of the United States, you're supposed to walk and chew gum and dance and do all kinds of things simultaneously. The president has certainly showed in his 2 weeks in office that he can focus on some issues and bring a laser light to them. I hope Yemen is not going to be wasted too much longer. Last thing I would say is about arms sales in general. Last thing the Middle East needs is major new arms sales. Let's be specific, UAE F-35 deal. Why in the world would we want to introduce into the Persian Gulf, an already volatile area with violence going on everywhere, an even more sophisticated weapon system? The result of bringing the F-35 into the UAE is clear. Other countries are going to ask for it. Qatar has already said if the UAE gets the F-35s, they want them too. And how are we going to say no to Qatar, which hosts our most important base in the region? And if we've sold them to the UAE and Qatar, how are we going to say no when the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia says we want them to? It's just very, very difficult. And of course, if we sell F-35s to the UAE, the Iranians are going to react by redoubling their efforts to build ballistic missile programs, drones, and other asymmetric weapons systems in order to attack Abu Dhabi. They're already, with the support of the Houthis, engaged in drone missile attacks on Saudi Arabia. They may have encouraged one of their pro-Iranian militia groups in Iraq to engage in a drone attack on Riyadh just last month. In this environment, the addition of more high sophisticated offensive weapons makes no sense. I would hope that the Congress would take action to block that sale. It's going to run into a horrific firestorm from the defense industries. It's going to run into a horrific firestorm from some in the US military who want to support a quote, little Sparta. This just makes no sense to add more weapons to a region that's already far too militarized as it is already.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. And Hassan, your final takeaways.
Yeah, Erik, I saw a couple questions in the chat. Is we're going to do a Q&A after, or should I?
Yes, doing the Q&A, yeah, after. Yep. But if you see something you want to answer, I think you can feel free to go ahead and do that as well.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate my colleagues' thoughts here. Bruce and Jehan, I think, hit the nail on the head. U.S. military support is really perpetuating the violence. I do want to get in, there were some top military policies that we discussed and policy changes that we can make. I wanted to just uplift that that's not the only thing that we should be doing. Obviously reversing the FTO designation, but restoring and expanding humanitarian aid to all parts of Yemen is also critical. Putting pressure on the Saudi-led coalition, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, to expand their funding pledges for humanitarian aid and reconstruction as well. The UAE last year, despite having $23 billion to spend on weapon sales, the F-35s, I would just raise up that I think we should also block the Reaper drones to the UAE and the munitions. But they had $23 billion for that and $0 for humanitarian assistance to Yemen. And I think that's deeply problematic. Saudi Arabia decreased its funding pledge as well. So, humanitarian assistance. I think we also need to publicly and consistently and publicly call out the blockade of Yemen. And that is just a real killer of people by cutting off the flow of food, fuel, medicine, clean water. And, it's making the FTO designation even worse. I mean, so many of these issues were already there because of the blockade and only made worse by the FTO designation. And I mean, there's really a lot that we can do. One other thing I would raise up, especially for folks on the House Foreign Affairs Committee here, is that I really believe that we need a new UN Security Council resolution on Yemen that explicitly, says no one in the world can send weapons to any of the warring parties in Yemen, not just the Houthis. So singling them out is really problematic. I think it needs to call out obstruction of humanitarian assistance by all parties. I think it needs to call out the blockade and then call for the need for a nationwide ceasefire. And, that's something that, that would be really helpful. And, last but not least, I just wanted to give this expression that's commonly used in Yemen and Jehan. If I mess this up, I always say she's my Yemeni sister from another mister. She's wonderful. I have some family in Aden, so I guess I got some street cred, but most of them are from Jordan. The saying is that it's me and my brother versus my cousin, me and my cousin versus the stranger. And I think that's just such an important international actors are coming in and trying to dictate terms that's not gonna work. And it's going to unite more Yemenis to think that that the U.S. is involved in this war. And I think by ending that, we can get Yemen back on the road to peace. Sorry if I cut out there.
No, we lost you just briefly, but then you came back. Somewhat, yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for that. So I think now we will shift over to some questions from the audience and other questions. I think we could start with, I think I think we could ask Jehan this or anyone. One thing we hear from a lot of Americans who aren't familiar with Yemen, or as we're pressuring to end this war, they say, well, Biden should be focusing on America. What is all this talk about Yemen? What would you say to people who have that point of view?
I would say I agree that our systems of healthcare and education need work. However, we need to stop disconnecting the role of the U.S. in foreign policy. It's all connected. Our federal budget spends 16% of it towards military spending. So it is really a matter to, and like Bruce said, it is an American war. So I think we need to focus on home definitely, but we need to also stop the role of the U.S. military and these transactions in the war on Yemen. I don't think it will be an American problem if the U.S. stops supporting these war crimes.
Thank you for that. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts. I think sometimes there's confusion. Are we asking the U.S. to help Yemen? Is actually, no, we're actually asking the U.S. to stop contributing to the harm. So I think people who want the U.S. out of the world, we actually have some common cause with that. People say focus on America. That's also what we're saying is let's get out of this war. So I think there is some overlap there. Kind of a more specific question about the arms sales, I think would be great for Bruce. What do you say to those who say that if we stop weapons sales to these countries, they will simply turn to Russia and China for those same weapons?
Well, the problem is you can't do that. You can't put a Russian radar system on an F-16. If you do, the pilot may be able to take off, but the chances of landing are pretty rare. You need to have American spare parts. You need to have the stuff made in the USA. And since we have end user arrangements with every country that we sell things to, which is they can't pass on American spare parts to another country without our permission. This effectively grounds the Royal Saudi Air Force, which is the principal mechanism by which Saudi Arabia fights the war, aside from the blockade, which is also dependent upon American spare parts, and probably also a good deal of American intelligence behind the scenes. So it's just not that easy. You know, Egypt made the decision to start transitioning from Soviet-Russian equipment back after the 1973 war in the early 70s to American equipment. They still haven't completed the transition. They still have more Soviet-made tanks than they have American-made tanks. And it would also be extremely expensive. One thing I would also say about Russia, Hassan rightly made the observation that among the other things we need to do is the new UN Security Council resolution. The Security Council resolution passed back in 2015 is entirely unbalanced. All of the blame for the war was solely upon the Houthis. Russia was the only country in the Security Council who made that point back in 2015. Now, in the end, the Russians abstained, so it went through. The Russians were the only ones to say this resolution was unbalanced. We do need a new resolution. Let me just say one other last thing. We shouldn't forget that this war began on Obama and Biden's watch. The time to stop this war most effectively was at its birth. The United States had clearly and unambiguously said to the Saudis in 2015, we're not going to support this. We're going to condemn you for this. The war would have never gotten off the ground. Consequently, Mr. Biden owns responsibility for this. He has a rare chance in life. Rarely in life, when you make a horrific mistake, you get a chance to go back and fix it. So the question of why not now? Why not now, Joe? Because you broke it. You need to fix it. Not in 2 months, but as soon as humanly possible.
Thank you so much for that. That's really, really helpful. You know, I think one thing to add there is that, you know, if you look back at 2015, actually now our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, was in Riyadh and announced the US support for the coalition. And it's a very interesting statement. And now he subsequently assigned letters calling for it to end. And we've seen dozens of Obama administration officials calling for it to end. And so I think we're waiting to hear a plan. You know, many people are waiting to hear the plan for that. And you know, after these initial steps, we haven't heard any further information on that. I think we have a question from the advocacy side. You know, what can we do to make constituents want to get more involved and aware? You know, people are tied up in a lot of movements. Some of them are very not good movements. Some of the, you know, crazy movements that we're seeing. You know, how can we get constituents to focus on this crucial cause?
Maybe, I don't know if Jehan wants to take a stab at that. You know, maybe I'll let her go first and I can try to fill in.
Yeah, I think I answered in the chat, but I can just repeat what I said. I think we can look at progressives like Ro Khanna, Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, for example, and they've really used their social media platforms to highlight the war on Yemen, to highlight the role of the West, the role of the US, and what can be done and what has been done previously. So I think that you know, other representatives can follow their lead and you know, interview and speak to folks like Hassan, Erik, or even some of the Yemeni activists that have been trying to push foreign policy away from intervention, away from wars and military action on behalf of the US. So I think that can be a good start, is just follow the lead of those who have been doing it already.
That's terrific. The only thing I would just add is things like the War Powers Resolution, because it forces the debate, and vote on U.S. military involvement in the war, it has this really amazing galvanizing effect on the grassroots and gives people a deadline to work towards, and really do that important outreach and educate their communities about this. So I think it's just a really, on top of just being important for Congress, it's really important because it gets so many people involved. So I would just really urge folks to use that vehicle.
Yeah, and on that note, Hassan, another question came in. Do you see an effort by Congressman Khanna to be adequate, or do we need something similar to the Sanders-Lee WPR in the Senate? Can you do it just with the House, or do you need the Senate as well?
Great question. I think ideally we'd have companions. We'd have a Senate companion and a House companion, and really kind of, not to be funny about it, but get the band back together. So many people have already done this. Murphy, Sanders, Lee. I think it would be wonderful if they, introduced language, in a companion way with Ro Khanna. And so, we're definitely talking to their offices, but we encourage, any of the staffers here that are supportive to be vocal about that, to reach out and let them know that your office, wants to help and do everything they can to push this forward. It's gonna be easier to, I think, get this off the ground if we have a companion in the Senate.
Great. Well, I think for the activists on the call, for the staffers on the call, that is something to really take into account and ensure that we can get that Senate companion. I think it's very important what you identified, the way that forcing the vote has historically led to members taking a position that they otherwise didn't take. They weren't as engaged. And so I think that's a very interesting observation. So I think with that, I think we have another question here. How much of the U.S. involvement in Iran is driven by that anti-Iran focus in Congress or among the general public? How should we tackle that particular aspect? I don't know who wants to take that one.
Bruce, you want to take a stab at it? Or?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting and complicated question. Certainly in the Trump administration, with its policy of maximum pressure on Iran, the war in Yemen became a subset of the war against, or the campaign against, the Iranians. And on that, of course, the Trump administration, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, all saw the same script. And I should also add into that list Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. This became a place to turn the war campaign against Yemen, a campaign against Iran, into a functional ground conflict against what was painted as a puppet of Iran. Now, of course, the Houthis have never been a puppet of Iran. The history of Yemen illustrates quite clearly that Yemenis are not puppets of anybody. The Saleh government was never a puppet of the United States, particularly whenever we wanted something hard done. He was always very adroit at avoiding doing it. And the Houthis are not puppets of the Iranians either. I should say a word about the Obama administration. I think a big part of the reason the Obama administration did not come out against the war back in 2015 was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. And I think the logic there was they knew that they were going to face a very difficult time convincing the United States to support the JCPOA. If you recall back 6 years ago, this was a very contentious issue. It will be a very contentious issue again in 2021. And the last thing the United States in the Obama administration wanted to do was to get the Saudis to be as vocally opposed to the JCPOA as the Israelis already were. They didn't want another large lobbying group working on this. So I think ironically in this case, they sought to appease Riyadh by going forward with supporting the war, in part in order to get a nuclear deal with the Iranians. I thought that was a mistake at the time. I think it would be an even bigger mistake now in seeking to get the JCPOA back on its feet to appease the Saudis on the Yemen war. You know, during the campaign, we heard from the Biden team that Saudi Arabia was a, quote, pariah. I'm a little bit disturbed to start hearing them now referring to Saudi Arabia as a partner. How did a partner become a pariah in just such a few short weeks? I'm hoping that that's just careful diplomatic terminology, but I liked pariah a lot better than I like partner.
Thank you for that. And I think on that note, we're reaching the end of our time here. So grateful to all the panelists. It's incredibly informative and useful briefing. We're coming up on 6 years of U.S. involvement in this war in just a few months or at the end of next month. And regardless of what happens, we're going to see a lot of action around this. And the war, according to what we're seeing from the Biden administration, from Congress, we're closer to ending. This war is closer to coming to an end than ever before, but it sounds like it's going to take some pushing from both the grassroots and from members of Congress and from the administration to get that done. So I should add that this entire panel will be sent around. Will be recording of the panel as well as information in case you want to review it or share with others. So on that note, I think we'll close it out. Thank you so much to our amazing panel and to all the folks who joined us. Thank you very much and have a great day.